The morning smelled of dust and judgment. Sunlight had barely crested the rim of the town roofs when the people began to gather. Boots scuffed against hard earth, skirts rustled, and whispers curled through the air like smoke. They stood in a half-circle, curious eyes turned toward the courthouse steps, toward the man and the woman who would be bound before breakfast. He stood first, tall and straight, as though the wind might bend him but never break him. His hat brim shadowed his eyes, his mouth pressed into a thin line. His hands hung loose at his sides, but there was nothing relaxed in him, only the quiet stillness of a man who wished to be somewhere else. She stood a few steps behind, small against the wide morning sky. Her dress was clean but plain, its faded calico almost the color of dust. Her hands were clasped in front of her, fingers tight enough to blanch. If she was frightened, she did not show it. If she was ashamed, she would not give them that satisfaction. Her chin stayed lifted, even as the preacher called them forward. No one smiled. The preacher's words rolled into the air, solemn as church bells, but the sound felt hollow, swallowed by the restless shifting of boots and the creak of saddle leather from the horses tied nearby. The man's answer, when it came, was so soft it nearly drowned beneath the sigh of the morning breeze. The woman's answer was steady, clear. When it was done, the crowd broke apart like a tide going out, some muttering, some staring, as though they had just watched a hanging. The preacher gave them a nod that was not quite congratulation and stepped down from the wooden platform. They did not look at each other as they mounted their horses. The ride to his homestead was a long, dry silence. The land rolled out before them in wide sweeps of golden grass and lonely sagebrush. The sky was so big it seemed to lean down to listen. She stole glances at him from time to time, at the hard line of his jaw, the set of his shoulders. He kept his gaze fixed ahead, as though she were not there. When the cabin finally appeared, it rose small and square against the endless prairie, smoke from the chimney smudging the sky. There was no welcome in it, not yet, only the simple fact of shelter. She dismounted and stood staring at the place that was now hers. The cabin smelled faintly of pine and smoke when he opened the door. Inside, it was clean, neat, and plainly a man's home. One chair pulled up near the hearth, a table scarred by years of use, shelves lined with tools and tin cups. He stepped aside to let her in, saying nothing. She crossed the threshold like a trespasser. The day stretched on. He busied himself outside with the horses, the tools, the woodpile, leaving her inside with her own thoughts. She unpacked the few belongings she had, laying them on the bed one by one, a shawl, a small comb, a book with its corners worn. When she was done, she sat for a while staring at the single window, listening to the wind whisper through the grass. Evening brought the faint rattle of coyotes far off. She cooked a simple supper, cornbread, beans, coffee, placing it on the table without a word. He ate in silence, nodding once when he was finished, a gesture that might have meant thanks. The nights were the hardest. The cabin creaked softly in the dark, a living thing breathing around her. She lay awake on the narrow bed, staring at the roof beams, hearing every shift of wind and rustle outside. Sometimes she thought of the town, of the faces that had watched judging. Sometimes she thought of leaving, but there was nowhere to go. The days passed one into the other. She mended what was torn, scrubbed what was dirty, swept the cabin until the floorboards shone pale as bone. It was not for him, not really. It was for herself, a way to make the space bearable. He spoke little, but his silences softened. He left water by the door when she washed clothes outside. He split extra firewood without being asked. These were small things, but they were noticed. Once the neighbor came, a stout, kindly widow from the next homestead over. She brought a loaf of bread and a handful of gossip. Her eyes lingered on the young bride, reading the quiet ache in her posture. She squeezed the girl's shoulder gently before leaving, and for the first time since the wedding, the girl felt something close to comfort. One late afternoon, she hummed softly while cooking, a tune she barely remembered from girlhood. He sat at the table mending a chair leg, hands steady, and for a moment he stopped working just to listen. She never saw the look that crossed his face, something halfway between surprise and recognition. Still, the distance remained, until the night the storm came. The wind howled out of nowhere, flinging dirt and broken leaves across the yard. Thunder cracked, close enough to rattle the windows. He went out into the darkness to tie down the wagon, to pull in what might blow away. She watched from the door until she could stand it no longer and ran to help, skirts dragging in the mud, hair coming loose. Together they fought the wind, hands fumbling with rope, the rain soaking them both. Lightning flared, for an instant turning the world to silver, her face pale and fierce, his eyes locked on hers. By the time the storm passed, they were dripping, breathless, clothes plastered to their skin. Inside, by the fire, they sat side by side, steam rising from their boots. Neither spoke. The only sound was the drip of rain from the eaves and the low crackle of the flames. He looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time saw more than the girl he had been forced to marry. He saw the grit in her spine, the courage that had brought her out into the storm when she might have stayed safe inside. She met his gaze for a heartbeat before looking away, cheeks warm, though not from a fire. When he stood, he left an extra quilt folded near her chair. It was the smallest kindness, but when she lay down that night beneath its weight, something shifted in her chest, quiet but undeniable. Morning came soft after the storm, the prairie shining under beads of water, as though the sky had wept pearls. She stepped outside barefoot, feeling the earth cool and damp beneath her toes. For the first time, she did not feel like a visitor. She felt like someone who belonged, if only a little. The days that followed carried a subtle change. His silences no longer pressed so hard. He started leaving coffee on the table before she woke, steam curling like a secret offering. Once, when a gust of wind tore her washing from the line, he ran across the yard and caught the cloth before it hit the mud, holding it out with a quiet smile that reached the corners of his eyes. She found herself speaking more, small things at first, about the weather, about what she might cook, about the book she was rereading for the third time. He listened, always listening, as though her words mattered. One evening she laughed. Really laughed. A shy, surprised sound that came when the barn cat leapt straight onto his shoulder and nearly knocked his hat into the dirt. He chuckled softly, and the sound warmed the whole cabin. That night she hummed while washing dishes, and he sat in the doorway, not working, just letting the tune fill the quiet. The world beyond their land did not stay quiet. Word came one afternoon, carried on the lips of a passing rider, that the man who had caused her ruin had been seen near town. The name made her blood go cold, not with fear, but with the ache of old hurt. That man's lies had left her alone, a stranger to her own kin. Her husband, yes, she was beginning to think of him as that, stood very still when he heard. His face gave nothing away, but his hand gripped the doorframe as if to keep from striking something. Days passed in a strange tension. She caught him watching the horizon often, jaw tight. She did not ask what he was thinking. Some things between them were still unspoken, like seeds under snow. It was nearly night when the man appeared. He came riding hard, a slanting sunset behind him, dust trailing like a banner. He dismounted near the gate, swaggering, calling out her name, as though it still belonged to him. Her husband stepped out of the cabin, calm as a stone, and told the man he was not welcome. There was no shouting, no fighting. Only the quiet threat of a man who had decided something in his bones. The stranger sneered, spat into the dirt, and rode away, promising he'd be back. That night was uneasy. She sat by the fire, staring into the flames until her eyes stung. He came to sit beside her, close enough that their knees nearly touched. For a long time, neither spoke. At last he said, low and steady, that he would not let anyone take her away. The words were not loud, but they fell into her heart like warm rain. She nodded, unable to answer, and for the first time, she wished he would touch her hand. The test came sooner than either of them expected. It began with smoke. She smelled it before she saw it, acrid and bitter, curling under the cabin door. He was on his feet at once, pulling on his boots, cursing softly. The barn was ablaze, an orange glare against the dark sky, the horses screaming inside. They ran together. The heat hit them like a wave, stinging eyes, choking lungs. He grabbed a bucket and dashed water against the flames, shouting for her to stay back, but she was already at the door, fighting to free the latch. The smoke seared her throat as she stumbled inside, found the nearest horse, and slapped it toward the open air. Her heart hammered. The world was fire and noise, the rafters groaning above. She turned for the second horse, tripped on a fallen beam, and would have gone down if he hadn't been there, pulling her up, half dragging her outside. They worked side by side until their arms felt carved from stone. The fire ate the barn down to its bones, but they saved the animals, saved the wagon, saved what they could. When it was done, they stood panting in the blackened yard, faces streaked with soot. The stars looked down cold and clear, as if nothing had happened. She swayed on her feet, suddenly lightheaded, and he caught her, holding her close against his chest. She could feel the hammer of his heart through his shirt. For a moment, neither moved, the night so still it seemed to hold its breath. When he spoke, it was her name, quiet like a prayer. She looked up, saw the streak of ash across his face, the tenderness in his eyes. Something in her broke loose then, and she leaned into him, not out of duty, not out of fear, but because she wanted to. They sat together on the cabin steps until dawn. The sky turned from black to violet to rose, the light spilling over the wounded yard. He took her hand then, rough fingers closing gently around hers, and told her he wanted her to stay, not because the town had said she must, not because of what had happened, but because he could not imagine this place without her. She pressed her cheek against his shoulder and let out a long breath, as though she had been holding it since the day she arrived. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, the prairie was quiet again, the smoke from the burned barn drifting away like a final ghost. The cabin stood small but unbroken, 2 mugs waiting on the table inside, a quilt folded neatly near the fire. Sometimes she thought, what begins as a chain becomes a shelter. Sometimes what is forced blooms into something chosen. And there, under the clean sky of a new morning, she chose him back. If this tale touched your heart, subscribe for more Wild West stories told by firelight.